Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. In this video, I'll demonstrate the process of replacing the heel flap and turn in a cuff-down heel flap and gusset sock. This technique relies on the original sock being knit with replacement in mind. If you haven't seen the demonstration of that process, you can find a link to that video up here or down in the video description. So one of the reasons that we used contrast yarn after we made the heel flap and the heel turn was in order to mark the location of the stitches that are going to have to be removed. So everything on this side of the contrast yarn is going to be preserved, and what we need to do is remove everything on this side of the contrast yarn up to the very top of the heel flap. There are always multiple ways of doing something like this, but I'm going to show you the way that I would tend to want to do it in order to make sure that I wasn't going to lose any live stitches and to be able to confirm that I've captured everything I need to capture. When we worked the heel flap and the heel turn, we worked across all of the stitches that were remaining after the heel turn. We worked across those in the contrast yarn. And so those look very much like regular stitches because they are. What we see along the sides here is the same color yarn, but the yarn over here was used to attach the heel flap to the cast-on edge for the gusset. So this yarn was a seaming yarn, but this yarn was knitted in. So what we want to do is capture all of those live stitches. Now it was knit in this direction originally, so we want to look at those contrast stitches and look for that V shape going all the way across. And then what we want to do is capture, using a very thin double-pointed needle, we want to capture the right leg of each of those V's going all the way across. The bright green of this contrast is very easy to see, so I'm going to look right above it in order to capture, like I said, the right leg of that V and then the right leg of the next one. So I'm going to go all the way across, capturing these stitches. So a thin needle, if you have one that's smaller than the needle that you use to knit the socks, that's always ideal. It isn't always possible. I think I used a size 1 to knit the sock, but this is a size 0 needle, so that's helpful. But certainly don't use one that's larger than you use to knit the socks if you can remember what size you used originally. So I think I have all of them. I think that I have caught all of them and that everything else is part of the seams, but I'm going to count my stitches and then I will tell you how you can confirm whether or not the number you have is what you should actually have. So I have 18 stitches on this needle, and I know that that is the correct amount. Here's how I know. This sock is a 64 stitch sock. Because I have a 64 stitch sock, that means that I had 32 stitches for the heel flap. This very standard round heel will have 2 stitches more than half of the heel. So I had 64 stitches for the sock, 32 for the heel. Half of that is 16. You add 2 and that's 18. So that way I know I have the right amount. You can use that formula if the number of heel stitches is a multiple of 4, which 32 is. If I had had a 60 stitch sock and so I had only 30 stitches for the heel flap, half of that would be 15 and 2 more would be 17. But you're always going to have an even number. And so you just go up 1 to the nearest even number. So whether you have 30 stitches for your heel flap or 32, you're going to have 18 on here. So you use that same process for any other stitch count. So I know that I have all of the stitches for the heel on the needle. You don't have to do this next step, but I think it's helpful to know where to stop when you're ripping back the heel, because it may not be completely obvious. When we started this heel, we were at the beginning of the round. We worked across all of the heel stitches just as knits. Then we turned and we knit garter stitch at the selvages. So you needed to do at least one knit stitch at each edge on the purl side. I did 3. And then it isn't until the 3rd row that you start slipping stitches so that you get the enlarged stitch. So the small stitch that's right below these enlarged slip stitches represent that knit stitch, the stitches that came off the needle as you worked across all in the knit stitches. And so that means this row here is the last row that you worked in the round. So if we capture this row right here, then we'll have everything on the needles that we need to have once the heel has been removed. If we look at the purl stitches, because we worked the garter stitch on that first purl row, we're going to see that represented here, and what we need to do is just go right below that purl bump. So right below that purl bump is where we want to capture, and that's going to end up being 2 rows below the big slip stitch. So I've got 3 purl bumps to look at. I've got one here, and one here. So I want to capture the stitch that's right below that, always going in the right leg of those stitches. All the way across, and you can see I've got a big stitch here, and then I've got a stitch under that, and then I've got the stitches on the needle. So I'm going to capture all 32 of the stitches on this needle. And again, you don't have to do this, but for me, it's just an insurance policy against ripping back too much or getting dropped stitches. I just know where I'm supposed to stop. I find that really helpful. If you want to rip back and then capture the live stitches, you could do that. I've got the stitch below the first purl bump, the stitch below the second. When I'm looking at the purl bumps, I'm looking at the upper bumps because there's a lower bump and then there's an upper bump. So I've got 2 of those, and there's the 3rd one. So I should have 32 stitches on my needle. So I'm just going to count and confirm that, and I do. So if you end up with an extra one, or then you can just, again, confirm your purl bumps. This is another reason why I think it's useful to have the 3 purl bumps at the edge rather than just the single purl bump. I just think it makes it an easier marker. Now it's time to remove the contrast yarn. Now, hopefully when you knit this sock, you did what I explained last week, which was any yarn tails associated with anything of the contrast yarn or of the heel flap were woven in the back of here, and any yarn tails associated with the foot after the contrast yarn was established here would be woven in on the gusset or the sole. And that's because if you wove in the tail that was hanging right here when you started joining in to work in the round, and you ended up weaving it in over here, when we cut this, you'll end up with no yarn tail. So hopefully you did that, but that's the reason why. So I have a pair of very sharp scissors, and what I'm going to do is lift up a leg of one of those contrast stitches and snip it. I want to make sure that I lift it up and away so that I don't have any of the main color yarn anywhere. So I'm going to snip that in a few places. Again, making sure that I'm not cutting the main color yarn. So you're going to pick all of this out. If this is a worn out heel and it's kind of felted, you might need to snip into the fabric here. That's okay, because the whole point is removing that part of the heel that needs to be replaced. Okay, I've got that out, so these are still secured on here, and now I need to remove this contrast yarn here. And again, you want to make sure that you're not going to snip any of the main color. So you get your scissors in there and snip that out. And again, if this is all very felted, you could just cut up in here and pick things out as best you can. Okay, I got that one out, and now I'm going to do the one over here as well. All right, so I have my sole stitches on a needle, and I have the leg stitches on the needle, and I just need to remove the flap. Now, if I can find the tail, I can just rip it back. Or like I said, if things are felted and it's really hard to do that, you can cut your flap to the point where there's no felting, where you can release stitches. And so then at that point, you can kind of pull yarn out until you can find something that will allow you to rip back. Here we go. Okay, so now I can just rip back, and it looks like I've got strings from more than one row, because things are kind of together. And that's another reason for keeping things on a needle here, is to make this process easier. So this is the yarn tail that is attached to the end of the round. I'm just going to trim this a little bit because I don't need that much tail. I'm going to get all my little scraps out of the way. Now we can start re-knitting the heel. Now you may have some yarn left over from when the sock was originally knit, or you might not. You might have to use some kind of a coordinating contrast color. And the nice thing about using a contrast color is that it's easy to see where the heel might need to get replaced the next time. And in fact, if you know you're going to be knitting a replaceable heel from the beginning, you might decide to knit the heel in a contrast color to begin with, because that means that you can use that contrast color to close up the edges so that there isn't this obvious high contrast color between the heel and the rest of the foot. So now I'm going to re-knit this heel just like I knit it the first time. I'm going to knit across all of these stitches for the first row. And as I do it, the medium blue color, we'll call this the bright blue and this is the medium blue. So as those stitches come off the needle, we'll get bright blue stitches on the needle. This gives you a clear indication the next time you need to replace this heel, because you would know that you're going to grab that medium blue on the needle when you are removing the sock heel the next time. So I'm going to go ahead and re-knit this heel the same exact way that I knit it the first time. So I have finished knitting the heel flap. I'm ready to the heel turn, and I want to just talk about how you know you've got the right length. I didn't mention this before. So presumably you have both socks. So if you didn't count the number of slip stitches that you had on your sock to begin with, you can do that by looking at the second sock. So I have another sock here that was knit with the same heel length. So if I count the slip stitches here on the left edge, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I have 16. So that means I'm going to work my knit setup row, and then I'm going to work 16 pairs of purl and then slip stitch. But when I'm done knitting the heel flap, what I'm going to see under my needle is 15 slip stitches. So I have my knit setup stitch here, and then I have 15 of these slip stitches. And that's because the last row I worked was a slip stitch row. When I worked my first row of the heel turn in this direction and I'm purling across, those slip stitches will come off the needle, and then I will see 16. So once the heel turn is worked, rather than doing what we did in the original sock, which was to cut the yarn and then slide the stitches to this end, join contrast yarn, and knit across, we don't need to do that now. We just need to graft these two halves together. Now, if you have the same color yarn for the heel that you used originally, you will need to use a contrast yarn again to graft this closed. But if you use a contrast color to knit the heel, then you don't have to switch out the yarn. You can use this yarn right here to graft it. So if you're left-handed, you can keep this heel side facing you and graft going in that direction. I'm right-handed, so I need to turn the work in order to graft it. So I want to leave a long enough tail and then some to graft across, because I'm also going to need to sew up this side. If I'd been thinking ahead, I would have left a long enough tail when I joined this yarn to knit the heel that could be used to sew it, but I was not thinking that far ahead. So I'm just going to cut an extra long strand of yarn in order to graft this closed. You should have the same number of stitches on each needle. We checked ahead of time that there would be 18, and when I finished turning the heel, I had 18. So I can graft these across. And I am going to do my setup for this graft. It's not like a sock toe where you might want to skip the setup rows or skip the setup stitches. And now I can just graft across as I would normally. Once the heel has been grafted shut, then you can use the tail to sew up this end. I am going to start though with this one. This has got to be woven in regardless, so you might as well use it to help you seam the edge as well. The process is the same to seam this shut as it was when you knit the sock originally. The garter edge, you'll see a sort of a trio of bumps for each garter ridge, and I take the one that is sort of above the other two is the one that I grab on this edge, and then on the other edge you go around the base of the cast on stitch that is above the edge right here. So I'm seaming as long as I can, and then this tail gets a little bit too short. So then I can turn around and I can use the end that resulted from the grafting, and then I can seam up in this direction. I'm working upside down along the edge here, so I'm catching an upside down V along this edge since I'm going in the opposite direction. So now I'm meeting up where these two are, so I'm just going to kind of cross over a bit and go into the garter bump where the other tail went through, just to completely close things up so that when I do weave them in, there will be no holes anywhere. So for the hole right here, I'm going to bring this tail through to the other side. And then I'm going to use the same trick I use anytime I have a hole like this. I'm going to run the tail around the perimeter of this hole here. Going through purl bumps. So once I've cinched that hole closed, then I can weave in the yarn tail somewhere along in here. So, and then on the inside, the seam looks like this. So there's not really a ridge, there's just the joining of stitches there. So just as neat and comfortable as it was the first time. So after you sew up this first edge, you sew up the second edge, and you have replaced the heel. And it's back to its original form. Now, I did not think of knitting a contrast heel to begin with, but that is a really good idea for having to avoid just that single line of contrast thread that surrounds the heel, the replaceable heel. In this case, with everything done in the contrast, the heel and the sewing thread, then you know when you are removing the heel the next time, or even the first time, if you start with a contrast heel, that as long as you are snipping yarn that is of this contrast color, you're okay. And as long as you avoid snipping any yarn that's of the main color, you'll be fine. But that's a way to really hide the fact that this is a replaceable heel, is to just choose a contrasting but complementary color initially, and you're good to go for a replaceable sock heel. I have lots of sock videos on my channel, many of which help with customizing socks to achieve a better fit. You can find links to all my sock videos over here, and you can find a link to my written tutorial on knitting custom fit socks that includes options for different heels and toes, and how to modify any of those heels and toes for a better fit. You can find a link to that tutorial down in the description as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.